this session where we are going to be talking about what role for the new constellation of growth in the global economy. We have 4 speakers with us: Dr. Olarn Chaipravat, advisor to the Prime Minister and President of the Thailand Trade Representative, former Deputy Prime Minister, Thailand. We have Mr. S. Ramadorai, Vice Chairman, Tata Consultancy Services and advisor to the Prime Minister. Ms. Patricia Hewitt, Chair, UK-India Business Council and former Secretary of State to Trade and Industry, United Kingdom. And last but not least, Ronnie, Chairman, Hang Lung Properties Limited, Hong Kong, SAR. Let me start with an exclamation. Oh, what web we have woven with the economies of the world. We may classify them into different categories. We may talk of the North and the South. We may talk of the industrialized world and the emerging economies. We may talk of G20 or BRICS. But we know today, more than at any other time, each economy for its growth performance is hugely interlinked with every other economy, thanks to trade, investment, innovation, IT revolution, and what have you. We have an excellent panel here to talk to us about their perspectives on what role for the new constellation of growth in the global economy. And I will begin with Dr. Olarn Chaipravat. 8 minutes for each speaker, and after that, we hope to have a lot of interaction with the audience. Please.
Thank you. When I look at the title of the meeting today, I wonder myself that what role can policymakers, policy advisors, or multinational company executives can play in the new constellation of growth going forward. But before I think we move to that area, I would like to clear in my mind what constitutes the new constellation of growth for the global economy in the next 10 to 20 years. As I understand it, in the last 30 years we had North-South dialogue and discussion. But now we have come to the point that perhaps going forward for the next 20 years, it might be useful to divide the whole world into 3 parts. I would stick to the north, but for the southern part of it, I would say we have 2 subparts, the middle income south and the south. My discussion would be concentrating on the middle income south in terms of policies and strategies and adjustments that are needed to fit into the new constellation of growth in the whole world. In order to, again, clarify myself a little bit, I think that I would presume that the new constellation would be something like for the North, the overall growth rate of GDP will be between 0 to 2% per year for the next 10 years or so. And then the South, both the middle income South and the South, the growth rate would be something between 5 to 9% per year. So that you can calculate easily that within 5 years, the percentage of GDP of the South, both the middle income and the South, would be gaining in terms of percentage multiples, as described by Mr. Kraut already. So why we have to look at the middle income South and its important role in the world economy in relation particularly with the South. I think the 30 years we witnessed the easy and rather inexpensive access to technology, particularly information technology and the internet, which gives rise to the social connectivity, social networking among the people, making the whole world a small village in terms of connectivity, communication, and so forth. And that sort of makes the concept of participatory democracy or people democracy as the grassroots and the middle income level something that we have seen in many parts of the world, including in Africa, in the Middle East, and the Arab Spring, and so on and so forth. And that in itself, because of the democratic system, requires support from the number of votes from the people. And that more or less forced many of the political organizations, parties, to adjust its economic development paradigm, especially for the South countries, from being a growth center for its own sake, as Mr. Crown mentioned, 7%, 8%, 9%, or even 10% growth was almost an objective in itself, regardless of how the fruits of the development are distributed. Now, I don't think that the countries of the middle income South can afford not to pay attention to the distribution aspects of the growth. So enter a new economic policy paradigm, so-called inclusive growth, which was championed by organizations like Asian Development Bank. Of course, many people look at the words inclusive growth differently, but here I just want to convey the sense that growth not for its own sake, but growth with much better income distributions, not only among individuals as measured by the Gini coefficient that we talked a bit earlier, but also across regions, across professions, and across producing sectors, from agriculture to agro-business to manufacturing and to service sectors. And the new economic paradigm of having a growth with much better income distributions seems to be on the agenda of many parties, political parties in the world, who are trying to get support from the people through direct and participatory democracy. So how to escape from the middle income trap has become an issue for many successful South countries, including most of the states in China, some states in India, countries Malaysia, South Korea, and Latin American countries, Middle East countries, and including my own country, Thailand. These countries have come to the point that we have successfully industrialized in the last 20 to 30 years. And we have come to the point that this is very important to distinguish between the middle income South and the South. That is, these countries have accumulated external reserves through the current account balances in the past, that all of them become net international creditor country. So it has enough of the resources in order to make use of going forward for development within the country, as well as for foreign investments into the South countries. There is a need for the government policy paradigm to shift and to give not only good words for distribution, but the government policy content must have clear ways and means of distributing the income better, while trying to foster growth through the development of the resources that are underutilized, manpower or otherwise, in the country. So the policy objective must be clear, and the policy actions must be clearly spelled out. We have seen in a number of countries, including China and United States, and then my own country, Thailand, adjustments in the wage and salaries in a rather big way compared to what happened in the past. And that constitutes the change in the paradigm, as well as improving the returns on the agricultural products for the farming sector. And this is one of many things that the middle income countries need to face in order to try to get it up from the current level to the next level of development, as well as the emphasis on the much larger role to be played by the small and medium size enterprises. Not only the large enterprises, but SMEs have become very important business organization for the middle income countries who want to move forward. And the assistance for the SME come in many forms, but particularly access to credits and ability to raise financing for the small, medium-sized enterprise are very critical in the new development process. Because of the weaker demand from the northern countries in terms of exportables, middle-income countries have no choice but to strike a more balanced approach to the stimulation for not only for export but also for domestic demand. And of course, trade and investment, tourism remain important vehicles to develop. But I think here the relationship of the large enterprises and multinationals from the middle income countries would be in the area of FDIs into the South countries in the next 10 to 20 years. And lastly, all the countries need to get the infrastructure investment programs going, and the financing of the large infrastructure investment program become very important element in the whole thing. And I am happy to hear that from the foreign minister of India that India would be taking the public-private sector approach to infrastructure financing. I think that's pretty much what I want to say at this point. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I now turn to Mr. Ramadorai, and please forgive me if I'm a little ruthless in keeping time. I only want better and greater interaction at the end. Thank you.
Thank you, and good evening, everyone. A new constellation of growth has emerged riding on the dynamics created by China, India, and Brazil. Even in the current slower growth context, countries such as Indonesia, South Africa, Singapore, Malaysia, Vietnam, Cambodia, Chile, Mexico, Peru, the GCC countries, Turkey, just to mention a few, are latching onto these dynamics with an increasing intensity in investment, financial, trade interactions. Now, whether it's the scale of the existing and potential demand or the demographic dividend enjoyed by most of these countries in this new constellation of growth, or the rapid absorption and leveraging of technologies, number of forces are making this new group of countries an increasingly potent factor in the global economic and business landscape, which in my opinion no corporate strategy can ignore. Now, what is the role for the new constellation of growth in the global economy? And some patterns of growth are very clearly visible from emerging markets which are noteworthy. One is clearly the rise of the middle class. One view is that the density and breadth of the country's middle class, more than mere share of the labor force, may determine whether a rising nation jumps to the level of a stable, enduring, high-wage job generating economy. And Brazil had its own fault and continues to be in the raw material supply, commodity exporter essentially, whereas a strong middle class now has emerged in East Asia and elsewhere in the developing world, could become a new global growth engine. Second one is the attracting global industry to meet domestic consumer demands. I think so far the global consumer demand has been concentrated in the rich economies of the OECD. One of the main drivers of global imbalance and certainly one of the prime underlying causes of the global financial crash of 2008 was the disproportionate reliance on exports by the emerging market economies. I think India's middle class is expected to grow in the next few decades. Emerging middle class in most emerging economies, including India, with their high purchasing power acting as the magnet for overseas investment. I think more than 52% of our investment comes from US, Germany, the UK, and France, and companies continue to be convinced of India's growth and foresee their presence in the country as a positive long-term opportunity. I think recent decisions in the FDI, multi-brand retail, aviation have been welcomed. Infrastructure continues to be contributes about 4% in FDI projects, 9% of the total jobs created in India. So the infrastructure spending is bound to increase, and the minister also said from $500 billion to $1 trillion in the next 5 years. But more importantly, India spends 4.7% of the GDP on infrastructure compared to 8.5% of GDP in China and 2.6% in the US. But I think ramping up spending would create millions of new jobs in India at a time when the country's sub 6% GDP growth is stoking concerns among policymakers that unemployment could spike, especially among the youth. But more importantly, 3.4 million new jobs could be created, direct and indirect, with an increase in infrastructure spending equivalent to 1% of the GDP. I think the corporate fixed investment in large projects dropped to 48.6% in 11-12 from 54.8%. This has had quite a ripple effect on the economy, namely investment in road, ports and airports has also decelerated sharply due to the red tapeism in the government processes and trouble in the entrenched coal and mining sectors and sizable losses in the public utilities and the political interest engines. Private sector wants more city planning before they dive in. Automotive is a classic success story. Almost all global manufacturers are here, and the country has seen 78 FDI deals in this sector by 2011, which has grown 28% since 2010. Retail and consumer products is another one, which is expected to create more than 30,000 jobs. And information technology has emerged as the global IT giant, and industry's size is close to $100 billion. Around 10 million people are directly or indirectly employed in this sector, and technology exports have increased from 4% to 25% over the last decade. I think agriculture grew only 3.3%, against a projection of 4% due to drought in the years 8, 9 and 9, 10. Industry grew by about 6.7% against a target of 10-11% in the 11th plan, but we hope to grow 10% with the new manufacturing policy in the manufacturing sector. The third one is attract global monies, create an attractive investment climate for a global investor, and emerging nations look at that very clearly, and a lot of policy initiatives have been taken in this space. And the FDI investment is likely to go up, and services sector attracted 19% of the total FDI inflows. Fourth one is focus on few strategic sectors or areas of strength which can catapult them on global stage or global attention. Classic examples are Singapore and Vietnam in water technologies. I think India has identified 20 high growth sectors and an unorganized sector till the year 2022. The labor intensive manufacturing sectors such as textiles and garments, leather and footwear, gem and jewelry, and food processing industry have been given weightage, seen as job generators, 100 million jobs in the manufacturing sector. The fourth one, the next one is drive innovation, where create products that serve domestic needs and then find a global market for them. Example, reverse innovation in India. And there are a number of examples in this. The telecom automotive industry in India have shown that in a number of ways. And the linkage oriented, namely in which linkages with foreign MNCs are used to obtain resources to innovate new products and services for the sophisticated customers in global markets. Several examples of innovations are present in the Taiwanese electronics industry and the Indian IT industry. There are two great examples of reverse innovation in the Indian context from the Tata Group, namely the Tata Swatch from Tata Chemicals, which is a very low cost water filter, and Tata Nano, of course, from Tata Motors. Other such examples are Mahindra and Mahindra small tractors that are now being sold to American hobby farmers, or GE's V-Scan, a portable ultrasound device that allows doctors to see inside patients, which was developed in China and is now being sold both in the rich and the poor countries. Focus on research development is another theme, and developing countries lag behind the development countries like the US or Europe or UK, where an ecosystem for research and development needs to be created. I think today the R&D investment in India is pretty low, but then this needs to increase to at least 2% of the GDP by the end of the 12th plan, with 1% each coming from the public and the private sector. Human capital investment will certainly have a multiplier effect, and we must avail of the local and national and global opportunities, because we need to see world as the marketplace. So looking beyond one's shores, local, national, global opportunities, and essentially integrating backwards is key to leveraging globalized marketplace. Lastly, demonstrate leadership and responsibility, develop sustainable models of growth, namely in the environmental, etc. Promote peace and security, and economic, technological, and social collaborations are a must. Technology is a major growth driver, and companies in developing economies must go global. Lastly, governance, because managing rising aspirations of youth with matching growth and job opportunities will certainly put pressure on outdated governance models, and we need to look at it. These were some of the submissions I wanted to make. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now turn to Patricia Hewitt.
Thank you very much indeed, and it's such a pleasure to be here with you this afternoon. I was delighted when my old friend Tarun Das asked me to come here. Of course, it's always a pleasure to leave London when it's grey and rainy and come to Delhi in the sun. But in the context of this conference, perhaps it's an even greater pleasure to leave a country where, sadly, we don't have any growth, in a region that doesn't have much growth, and come to a conference of the growth economies in one of the most exciting growth economies of them all. And you know, if we look back just for a moment to the period before the global financial crisis, there was, to put it gently, an extraordinary self-confidence in the developed countries that policymakers knew the answers to all the problems. And there was not just an extraordinary self-confidence, but indeed quite an arrogance in the way that developed country representatives sought to tell the South, the emerging economies, what they needed to do. I think the global financial crisis and now the Eurozone sovereign debt crisis, well, I hope, I hope those twin crises have put an end to that spirit of arrogance. At the very least, there should be a sense of partnership, equality and respect, and indeed, frankly, given the scale and impact of the global financial crisis and what is now happening in the Eurozone, I think those of us who come from the low growth or no growth economies really should adopt quite a spirit of humility. Now, I wanted just to offer a couple of comments on three interconnected areas: trade, global institution building, and domestic growth. First of all, on the issue of trade, I largely agree with what we just heard from the Minister in his excellent speech and very lively question session about the new web of regional and bilateral trade agreements, notably between the re-emerging economies, but also, of course, agreements between those new economies and the European Union, or indeed the United States. And certainly, I was the British Cabinet Minister for Trade when we launched the Doha round. I very strongly supported and pushed within the European Union for an approach to trade negotiations that would meet, as far as possible, all the needs of the emerging economies and make it truly a development round. I hope very much that this year we can conclude the comprehensive trade agreement between the European Union and India, and that we'll move rapidly forward on a number of others, including, of course, that with Thailand, where the negotiations have just been launched. But I wouldn't perhaps completely agree with the Minister on one point. I don't think we should give up, as it were, on trying to do some things directly under the WTO umbrella. Clearly, we are not going to get the Doha development round in a single set of agreements as had originally been hoped. But I do think on the issue of trade facilitation and dealing with all those administrative and customs barriers that hold back so much trade in the world, there really is the possibility of a WTO-wide agreement on that relatively narrow set of issues, and a set of issues that are much less controversial than, for instance, opening up industrial markets or even dealing with some of the outrageous agricultural subsidies still left in the developed world. And I think if we could get that agreement on trade facilitation, certainly the some $40 billion boost that it would give to the world economy would be a hugely important impetus to growth itself. It would be a confidence builder, and at least 2/3 of that benefit would go directly to the re-emerging economies. So leadership on that, because it can only really come from the re-emerging economies themselves, could, I think, deliver a very big prize. Secondly, the issue of global economic governance and institution building. We've heard already a little bit about the huge importance of the G20 representing the real constellation of economic strength in the global economy, rather than the old G8. And if anything good came out of the global financial crisis, that certainly was it. I'm not a critic of the G20. I'm very conscious as a European of just how long it took to build the European Union institutions, and that is certainly not finished business as we're seeing in the current crisis now. The G20 is less than 5 years old. It doesn't even have a permanent secretariat, never mind the framework of rules and procedures that the European Union or indeed the WTO have. But I think strengthening the economic peer review process within the G20, and in particular the understanding of the international consequences of domestic policy actions, that would be an important step forward. Clearly, continuing on the path of reforming the IMF and overcoming resistance to that, notably in Washington, that will be critical, and more broadly completing the financial reforms within the global financial architecture, where sadly we're still a long way off. Final couple of comments just on the issue of domestic growth. We're all aware, I think, that the interlinkages in the global economy are now so deep and so complex that we need every country and every part of the world to undertake the necessary structural changes, either to return to growth in the case of Europe, but to sustain and indeed to raise growth rates in the re-emerging economies. And I think the supply side reforms that were very much the focus of the most recent Indian budget, and on which Mr. Ramadorai has just set out, I think, an excellent stall, as it were, those are absolutely critical. And I think perhaps the most important there, again, one in all our countries, is enabling young people, young women as well as young men, to come into the labour market, to be equipped with the skills and the confidence they need to enter into the new jobs, to create the new businesses and therefore more new jobs, and to become producers but also consumers in the global as well as the local economy. That, along with the other supply side reforms that will vary a bit from economy to economy, are absolutely critical. And my final comment is this: I'm very much an ex-politician. I work now in business and in the not-for-profit sector, including with an NGO based here in Delhi. But I'm acutely aware that many of these economic challenges, many of these economic reforms, whether they're global or domestic, they're difficult politically. I remember making the argument very strongly when call centres in Britain started to move to India, that this was not a threat to jobs in Britain, that as India grew, Britain would grow. I didn't expect TCS and others quite so quickly to be investing in new call centres in Britain, even as they expanded those in India as well. But that argument, supporting those who are losers in the process of globalization to overcome whatever changes have caused that loss, and then ensuring, as others have said, that the fruits of global growth are spread fairly so that it is genuinely inclusive growth, that is absolutely critical to the mission, if you like, of this conference, of the global net, and our purpose here in the next few days. So thank you.
Thank you. I'll now turn to Ronnie Chen.
Well, Isha and I have known Isha for about 17, 18 years. I have tremendous respect for her. So whatever she tells me to do, I do. 8 minutes and the role of the constellation of growth. Of course, being a good ethnic Chinese, I can do only what I'm told. So 7 points on what the roles of these constellation of growth. The first one is the constellation of growth is going to be the other guy. It will not be the only guy. When Britain took over from Spain as a global leader, it was the only guy. When America took over from Britain, it was the only guy. But now, the constellation of growth will not be the only guy. It is, in fact, the other guy. Meaning that, let's not declare the death of Mark Twain so soon. The United States in particular is going to be very, very powerful. And so the growth, be it China, be it India, be it South Africa, whatever, it is only the other guy. Now, that obviously is not one guy, but a constellation of guys. But the fact that it is the other makes things a little bit more complicated. That's the first one. The second one is, it's a leapfrogger. As is always the case, the new guy always tend to leapfrog. But perhaps this time a little bit more. Because in the old days, you still need to have some scientific breakthrough or some technological breakthrough. This time the internet is equalizer. Now anybody can, you can argue that the biggest user of internet today is perhaps India and China. And so the leapfrogging is perhaps more than ever before. The third one, it's a nouveau riche. It's a newly rich. I think morally speaking, nobody can say that it is not good. India and China have lifted 1.5 billion perhaps people out of poverty. And so from a moral perspective, I think the newly rich, it's absolutely something that we all should support. And let's face it, at the beginning of the last century, or even in the middle of the last century, even at the end of the last century, the growth was extraordinary, the wealth was extraordinarily unevenly distributed. And perhaps for once, the newly rich will balance things out a little bit. The fourth one is, obviously, these countries that are the constellation of growth are consumers of natural resources, but that's nothing new. In the late second half of the 19th century, Britain consumed more steel and coal than anybody else. In the beginning part of the 20th century, America did the same thing. So now it is China, it is India, it is some other country of the constellation. But unlike perhaps some of the previous times, the Chinese and the Indians are not stealing it. Sorry, Patricia, like the Brits did in the old days of colonialism. I remember speaking one time in Berlin, or Frankfurt was it, an Indian gentleman and I were on the podium together, and he said something very interesting. He said, you know, Ronnie, India is just going exactly where China is going. You're buying natural resources everywhere. We're buying everywhere. We're just so happy to just hide behind China so that we don't get the brunt of it. But whatever it is, we're buying it. We're not stealing it, okay? So give us some credit for that. Number 5. The constellation of growth these days can be an inventor. You may be surprised to hear that how can these poor countries be, re-emerging countries be inventors? Well, first of all, when China, say for example, and I assume India to some extent as well, when we were poor, the whole world is deprived of 40% of the world's population between the two of us, exactly, of the intellect, of the creativity, of the artistic, ingenuity of 40% of the world's people. It's gone. You just don't hear about it. It's there, but very minimal. So the rising of the constellation of growth is the unleashing of creativity, the likes of which perhaps the West have never seen. And perhaps you may even say that it is kind of renaissance. And I think that would be a wonderful, wonderful, wonderful thing. And I would say that it is not just in, design, clothing, literature, movie, what have you, but I think it's even in institutional innovation. I think that, we talked in the first session with Claude, how the Western democracy, people have called into question that perhaps it has its limitation. Now, obviously, the autocratic way, as far as I'm concerned, it cannot last. But is there some way that we can innovate in institutions by combining the two? In which case, I think the constellation of growth, at least some of them, can be an inventor in this regard as well. Number 6. The constellation of growth is going to be a spoiler of world order. Like it or not, whenever there's a growth of somebody, the stage is a little bit more crowded. It used to be a simple world, bipolar world. Now it's a multipolar world, and very much so, and not just one, but a constellation of them. And so the whole world order of necessity will have to change. And as somebody said earlier in the first session, public governance is certainly not following suit. And as a result, the world may be a lot messier place than you and I like to look at. In a conference like this, we only look at the positive. Seldom do we look at potential problems that can be raised also by the growth of many in the constellation of growth. That finally, the constellation of growth will be a kind of new, more or less equal partners. Let's face it, it's not quite equal. Nothing is real. I mean, I'm a born ugly short guy, so I know from my youth that the world is not equal. So to be politically correct, you call yourself equal, but we are not. But so we are more or less equal. By that I mean, north-south, perhaps there's still quite a bit of time that needs to take place and progress before it can be more or less equals. But if you were to look at the east-west, say on the two sides of the Pacific, it is certainly increasingly becoming a more or less equal partnership. And the world has never had a time when there are two major power centers that can coexist in a peaceful way. And so I laud Claude and Tarun for putting this thing together. I think this is wonderful. Perhaps we can find some innovation even in institutional building through this discussion, that hopefully, whether it is east-west, whether it is north-south, hopefully we'll be able to live together peacefully for many years to come. Thank you.
Thank you, Ronnie. Well, certainly we've had a lot of stimulating thoughts presented here. And now I
Patricia, you're not on.
the floor.
You're not on. Microphone, can you hear?
It's working.
Okay, sorry. Maybe it's acoustic here. Okay.
Sorry. So I open the floor for questions and comments. I would request you to introduce yourself and please be brief. If you want to target your question or comment to a specific speaker, do mention it. I'm going to collect about 6 questions and then turn to the panel. Yes, please.
I'm a veteran of 4 wars and a dabble in common sense economics. Thank you, Chair. All the panelists in this session and the foreign minister in the previous have been stressing on these middle income groups. There's no gainsaying that these middle income groups are the aspirants. They are going to be the spenders and they are going to drive the economy of any country. Take India. If every chappie buys 1 toothpaste in a year, you'll be selling 400 million toothpastes. Anyway, my question, which my erstwhile colleague, Mr. Ramadorai from TCS may like to comment on is, you have the highly established high growth societies in the north, as was brought out by the first speaker, even in the developing societies like India. How do you envisage that these organizations, these societies can help the middle income groups in the developing countries to grow even further, and more importantly, the low income groups that are not even part of this? And as our foreign minister said, how do you envisage bridging the gap between the low and the middle? And incidentally,
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay.
May
Thanks.
I? Please.
My name's Alan Rosling. Dr. Ahluwalia, if I could ask you the question. I was very disappointed to see that you were going to chair this session because I wanted to hear from you as one of the architects of India's reforms. Could I ask you to comment on the question the panel is talking on?
It wouldn't be fair, but you can go ahead with
Fairness
the question.
and equity is nothing in this life, as you know. So is there such a thing as a constellation of growth? And if so, how do we make it more real than just a nice term?
Okay. Any more questions? Yes, please.
Please, I want to talk about the African global community. You know, you're talking
Would
about...
you introduce yourself, please?
My name is Udwak Obonglawa from Nigeria.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm asking about the plan the growth network is putting in place for Africa as an emerging market. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, please, the gentleman here.
Jean-Pierre Lehmann, IMD Switzerland. It's amazing how with all these technological developments that we always have problems with these mics. I guess this is addressed to Ms. Hewitt. You talked about the WTO, you talked about the Doha round. And again, in the spirit of looking at things as they are rather than as we would like them to be, don't you think there's a very grave risk that the multilateral system in trade and in other areas, like climate change, will in fact break down? And what implications will this have in terms of this constellation of growth that we're talking about? In other words, is the problem of global governance not much, much, much more acute than we pretend?
One more question and then I'll turn to the panel. Yes, please.
Good afternoon. My name is Jimmy Kochana, President of Sangoko in South Africa. I've been listening to all the presentation, starting from the minister to the panel, but I think one thing that perturbs me is reference to this new constellation of growth that precludes the involvement of citizens in
Could you
shaping.
repeat that, please?
I'm saying I've listened to all the presentation this morning. What I've not heard is how can the citizens of each and every country could be involved in shaping this new constellation of growth, because it is imperative that people get involved in the shaping of this development trajectory. Thank you.
Thank you. May I now turn to the Patricia, since the global governance is specifically addressed to you?
Well, thank you very much, sir, for your very interesting question and your very fair challenge. I think on the look, I have to say by nature I'm an optimist, so you know the glass is half full for me rather than half empty and declining. But clearly there are major risks to our multilateral institutions. I think in the case of the WTO, it has the advantage, frankly, of a set of rules which all members, including the newest members, have signed up to, and a set of procedures for dealing with disputes between member states. And I think the result of that is that actually a lot of member states, including those in this new constellation of growth, as well as developed countries, have a real interest actually in sustaining the WTO because they can use it to deal with trade disputes. We may or may not think individual disputes are well-founded, but nonetheless, having a process there that enables proper adjudication about allegations of unfair dumping or trade you know, whatever the issue is, I think is very helpful. That does not mean that a fresh round, particularly on the scale of ambition of Doha, can be concluded. I don't think it can. And the efforts that were being made some years ago to try and reform the institutions of the WTO itself don't seem to have got as far as many of us hoped at the time. As I said on that one, I think cutting the elephant into bite-sized pieces and taking the first bite at trade facilitation would make very good sense, and indeed not just for the direct benefits that it would give, but also because it would help to strengthen and retain an institution which isn't perfect because they never are, but nonetheless could be really important to the future of global economic governance. On climate change, it's much harder because the institutions are so much less mature and there isn't that same sense of at least a common interest in having a set of rules and an arbitration procedure that goes with them. I hope it will be possible for the very deep disputes on climate change matters to be resolved at least sufficiently to give us a new multilateral binding agreement. But there are others here who are much more expert on that aspect, I'm afraid, than I am.
Thank you. Olarn, you talked about the income distribution challenge. There was a question about how to include the low-income groups. Would you care to respond to that? Then I'll turn to Mr. Ramadorai specifically for India.
Okay. The issues on the income distribution is the most complicated issue. It was mentioned for many, many years, but not really being quantified. How do we measure income distribution? Of course, we have a standard thing to measure inequality in the Gini coefficient type, and it was quoted. But if you look at the group that we measure, say the people of Thailand of 10 years ago and people of Thailand now, and you distribute the income, you see that between 10-year education is different, experience different, everything is completely different, so you cannot expect that to change in some meaningful manner. So I think there's a need for us to think out loudly on top of the inter-individual measurement of income inequality. Do we want to measure income disparity across region of one state vis-a-vis another state? In the case of China, do they want to measure income inequality between the eastern seaboard state and the western state? Clearly, I think a country like China has this in mind. That's why they have adopted the Go West policy. But how you measure it, you can measure by regional difference, you can measure by professional differences, or by producing sectors. And I would like to pay attention to the last measurement, that the income distribution across people who engage in agricultural activity, people who engage in manufacturing activities, and income of the people who engage in the service, particularly tourism activity. If you take most economies in Asia, not very large like India or China, but so we look at the state in India and treat it as a country, because there are certain state in India has 100 million people, which is larger than most countries in the world with about 30 or 40 million people. And if you look at that, you see that the distribution across producing sectors, because we have adopted the paradigm of development can only go from agricultural sector to manufacturing and to service sector. So knowingly or non-knowingly, many of the countries adopt the policy of keeping real wage very, very low through low stable food price, for example, rice or wheat, in order to push the farm workers out of the farming sector toward the industrial sector, which offer higher wage rate. And that's facilitate the flow of the people from agricultural sector to manufacturing and to service sector. And in the case of the Western country, they have reached a point where the service sector is not only a service like tourism, but also financial services with exorbitantly high rates of return for the people who work in the financial sectors, thanks to all these Wall Street type of things. I myself work in the financial sector. I was a bank chief executive for a number of years. I know how income is being distributed.
Thank
so how do we equalize this? And you see the efforts through the British system of capping a cap on the bonus of the financial executives. You have in US and you have many countries. But in the countries in Asia like Thailand and Malaysia and so on, the achievement of the income is through the raising of the minimum wage level for the grassroots workers and for the middle income people.
Yeah. May I now turn to Mr. Ramdev?
Yeah, I think the middle class in India, as per a 2000 study by McKinsey Global Institute, said that it's going to go up from 5% to about almost 40% in the next 2 decades or so. Given that, on top of it, if you layer the unleashing of creativity that was talked about, which is access, visibility, cost to get a product through technology, affordability with a global talent, and frugal innovation, the governance structure, you are going to get to address the set of population which is even below the poverty line. If you take Kenya as an example, and M-Pesa in terms of mobile payments is a phenomenal frugal innovation which has completely been adopted by that country. So I think the policy framework, even if you look at the current budget, talks about the health sector, the education, and then of course the skills building, and all of them go hand in hand as part of the ecosystem itself. So that addresses the needs of below the poverty line, lower middle income, and the middle class, and then onto the higher aspirations. These are the enablers in short.
Ronnie.
I thought the question was directed to
No,
you.
I will-
Sorry,
I
Mother.
will come,
Oh,
but
okay.
after you.
Very simple. The first question: what can the high-income countries do? Keep your market open. Number one. Number two:
Yeah.
help educate the other countries. For example, if the United States really George Bush, for example, really want to do Africa, good, right? So why don't they get 100,000 every year from Africa and educate them in the United States, and with the stipulation that it must go back. My family have been giving scholarship for the last 30, 40 years, and we did that for a period of time in China. We give you a scholarship all free, but you have to sign a paper that you will go back to China after you finish. If you don't, you pay us the tuition. And so there are ways to do it. Then finally, the last comment is what can individuals do? I certainly don't qualify to answer about Africa. Look at China. In 1979, when it first opened up, out of Cultural Revolution, horrific condition, the world was not friendly, in particular toward China. If you have to rely on anybody else, they are sunk. The only person that they can rely on is themselves. And so I think that, rather than look to others, I think perhaps the gentleman's last question was correct. Look to yourself. And I'm a humble guy. I'm just a simple guy, a simple businessman. If what I do has a little bit of effect on the world, I'm a happy man. So I don't know how to answer that question, what an individual can do, except get better yourself.
Okay, I take a couple of minutes to answer your question and bring the focus to India only because that's my comparative advantage. And I think what I'm going to say would be as relevant for any other emerging economy. What we've seen in India in the last 10 years is that when you have transition to a very rapid growth for say 9 to 10 years, when you are a democracy, naturally you have rising expectations along with rising incomes. And if you are at that spot in demographic transition where we are, you have the youth which has seen the rising growth, rising incomes, their expectations exceed even what you can deliver. But what is most important is that in a period like that, you see a massive structural transformation of the economy, where you have sectors like industry and services, particularly services that have led this growth, where you've had private sector leading that growth in an economy which was earlier on very used to a mixed, confused signals for growth. You have the greater scope for market forces within the economy, and you have greater integration with the rest of the world. Now, as that happens, your institutions of governance need to adjust. Patricia talked about international, multilateral institutions of governance, but when you have such major need for relocation of resources, new sectors, new areas, and where growth is emerging, you need your institutions of administration, your institutions of judiciary, your laws, your social institutions. Everything has to adjust to keep pace with that. And as we know, institutions take time to adjust. And at that stage, what happens is, it looks like collapse of governance, but actually what it is really the turbulence that you see when you break the sound barrier and you exit from 5% growth to 8% growth. And in a democracy with a vibrant media and an NGO sector, we let it all hang out as we try to go 2 steps forward, 1 step backward. And I think this is only to be expected because we are doing in a much shorter period what today's industrialized world did over a much longer period. We have the benefit of technology, IT revolution, all of that, which is helping us, but we also have the challenge of an impatient young generation. As you know, in India, the percentage of working age population in total population will continue to rise until 2050. Now, this only gives us a demographic opportunity. We have to create a dividend out of it. And that's why education, health, livable cities, all these things have to come in place. It is not just about creating an investment climate. It is creating an environment which provides agglomeration economies for non-agricultural sectors, providing connectivity which connects the urban sector to the rural sector. We only have 31% of our population which is urban today. From 377 million today, this is going to increase to 600 million by 2031. So the challenges are enormous, but these challenges are seen as opportunities by a country which has shown that in some sectors, in some states, in some areas, we can do it. And that confidence is new. As the minister said, it is that confidence which is leading to a reverse brain drain, leading to people not just looking for jobs in government, but looking for opportunities for entrepreneurship. And I think one thing which has not been stated when we've talked about income distribution, and I know that Mr. Ramadorai normally speaks about it quite a bit, is that we have to make our growth employment intensive. Right. It's only when we expand employment opportunities. So I think these schism within each economy, that will only be resolved as we negotiate these different dimensions of growth and development. You're going to get sustainable growth in India, but not because the industrialized countries come and tell us you need to protect your environment. You're going to get sustainable development because citizens of Delhi demand good public health conditions. So we will be getting our local governments. There is this need to decentralize, need to demand accountability, and as that happens, market is a decentralizer. So I think we are on course, but it is not going to be a straightforward course which is going to be dictated by any planner. It's going to be bringing together socio-economic planning with spatial planning, bringing the role of state to supplement and facilitate and regulate the development of the private sector. And I'm sure in each emerging economy, in different proportions, we are talking of the same challenges. You know, they just look larger than life in a democracy like India because we let it all hang out for you to see. And therefore, I have no doubt that as these multiple poles emerge in different parts of the world, we will have a better world. We will bring out of this a global governance architecture because each stakeholder will realize that it will lead to a win-win situation. And I think the world has been pushed to an edge. So I'm very hopeful that a response will emerge from this. Thank you.
Very good.
And thank you very much to all the panelists.
Ladies and gentlemen, the drinks are going to be served right behind you. It's ready. We'll ask you to come back in about 30 minutes to this room for the real treat. The real treat is not the drinks. It's what's happening afterwards, and it's a conversation between two of the most fascinating, insightful and brilliant business leaders in the world now. So we'll ask you to go have a drink, come back in about 30 minutes, we'll have our last session of the day, and then we'll move to dinner across the hall in this direction. Thank you.